All right, so and moving into the next section, what I want to talk about is some market trends around the state of the tape market today. Information that in some cases is research that's pulled from companies that are here in the room. In other places, it's some newly released reports that actually were just finalized a couple of days ago. And what I wanted to really have you have as a takeaway from this portion of the session is what is the actual state of the tape market? What's the size? What are the trends? Where is the reality of where we are in this market today? One of the things that I find kind of interesting is we're starting to talk about moving from petascale to exascale computing. Spectra moved into the petascale computing market back around 2005 is when we were able to start to deliver petascale systems. Over the last year, I'm sure you all have seen and written about and read about some of the announcements that Nimbus, for example, was announcing their first 100 terabyte flash sale. Apple did an announcement of their first petabyte storage sale. We went and looked. We don't actually track our customers on the petascale range, but a back of the envelope estimate is we have well over 150 petascale customers using Spectra equipment today. So to give you a feel for why Spectra, as you're really looking at big data, exascale computing, exascale storage, is a logical transition for us. We're already well into the petascale range with hundreds of customers using our storage in that way today. Moving on to exascale is a logical transition. We have customers in RFPs and awards currently in the exascale market, so we know the market is here today on the very high end for needing this type of storage. And so we are positioned as a company today to show you the vision of what exascale storage really looks like and why in the tape market is really necessary today. There's a new report that's just being released from an organization called INSIC. I'm on the board of it along with Oracle, IBM, Symantec, HP, Imation, and Quantum. So pretty much the folks who are developing and visionaries for the tape market. Some of the analysts in this room over the summer gave us information as we were developing this report on trends in various markets. And we've compiled that all to release the latest technology report. And a couple of conclusions that I think are really important for you to be aware of. 2008, that tape report from INSIC was pretty bleak. It was when deduplication was hitting the market, when customers understood backup but didn't really understand archive, and all the trends were forecasting downward. There was a major shift in the market in 2009 when the mid-range of tape libraries, so that's about the 100 to 1,000 slot tape libraries, you figure there's 1.5 terabytes in general on a tape that goes into each of those slots. So you're talking a few hundred terabytes up to a few petabytes. That portion of the tape market started to grow again in 2009. The reason that it did, and as INSIC has really tracked these trends, the first piece is active archiving. And these are quotes directly out of the INSIC report that active archive is the most promising segment of the market growth currently. I'm going to go through for you what exactly active archive is. We've talked about it a lot. I'm going to do a bit of a refresher and tell you more about where that is today. Regulatory compliance, and I believe that this is a Fred Moore number that says 20 to 25% of all business data created today must be kept for regulatory compliance needs. That's a staggering amount. As you start to look at data growth, data is growing at about 70 to 80% on average across all markets every year, and 20 to 25% of that is required to be kept for compliance. It's a growing area that tape is being utilized more and more frequently. And even though we've talked about it for years, the quantity of data being kept for compliance is another reason why that portion of the tape market has started to grow again. And then disaster recovery. The offline copy of data that's not susceptible to viruses, is not susceptible to being replicated between systems, is not susceptible to any sort of online attack. We saw the issues Google had. All of us talked about it, where they lost, I think it was 0.9% of their mailbox users in a replication problem in their data center, went back to their tape library to get that data. Those kinds of big announcements we hear about very frequently in our customer base. They're just not nearly as newsworthy, where they go back and have to go to their offline tape copy because of a corrupted data file on disk or something else that they have to go back to their tape for their recovery. So some of the bottom two are areas we've talked about for a long time. The active archive is really the growing new area that's getting enormous quantities of data into tape in petascale and exascale systems. So separating backup and archive, just to make sure as we go through today, the terminology we all agree on. A backup is a copy of your data. It's usually run through a backup application, like a Symantec Net Backup, Commvault Galaxy, Sympana, any of those backup applications. It's making a second, third, fourth, fifth copy of your data. An archive is typically considered a repository. It's something where you go for your preserved data over a long period of time. It may not have metadata associated with it. It may not have online capability to access it from the internet in a digital sort of way. So an archive typically is considered offline, not powered, and a really in-the-drawer repository. And then an active archive is taking the archive a step further, being able to access it through a file system, be able to access all those files with complete metadata engines so that you can search it, query it, and actually drive business value from the data. As big data continues to grow, there's companies talking about the analytics side, and there's companies talking about the data side. What Active Archive does is brings the two together. You have your metadata engine that's fully aware of all the files and all the unstructured data out there in the world, in your environment, have metadata associated with it, and can track it and use it off any sort of storage media that you have. In the Spectra, petascale, and some of the exascale environments that we're now responding to proposals on, all of those customers are using Active Archives in some way. Different tools, different fashions. Some are custom programs, some are vendor-provided software, but the one commonality in all of those big data environments that we're introduced in is that they are all using active archiving. So looking at what kind of problems that customers are facing today that the tape market solved over the last few years that really has made it turn back into a growth market, the first one is I can't hit my backup window. We hear that less and less and less. Disk cache, deduplication systems, various kinds of buffers have been introduced to be able to make sure customers can meet their backup windows. The problem they're meeting now is their data is growing so fast that if they use their standard backup strategies, there's just so much data that they either need to throw a whole bunch more storage at it or they need to approach a different route. That's where they're turning to archive. They're figuring out how can I get less data on my primary disk so that my backup windows for the items that I do need to make multiple copies of can fit into my backup window. Another issue customers are starting to run across is that they don't have enough storage for their transactional data, that they have the need for very high performance, whether it's flash, solid state, enterprise disk. They just don't have enough to do all the transactional data that they need in a big data environment. What do they do about that? They know that they need to be driving value out of the data they're keeping. They know they can't continue to buy very high-end flash or cache systems to do the transactions on. So they need solutions on how they can offload all but the most important information to less expensive, slower storage in order to take advantage of the flash for really what it's needed. And then lastly, when folks are out of storage space, you hear about it all the time. I just need to buy another rack of disk. I keep running out of storage. I can't implement enough policies in my user's environment to get them to save only the most important data on our primary storage. You can't get those kinds of policies pushed through the organization fast enough to kind of hold the data growth in check. So again, looking at why are customers archiving and why is the tape market growing is because we now have tools to very seamlessly offload primary storage onto these tape libraries through a standard file system interface. The type of growth that we're seeing, this is a slide that most of you have probably seen. It's not a new slide, but it really does illustrate well what's going on in the market. That as the tape market grows, we're seeing about a 45% compound annual growth rate on the amount of file system data sitting on tape. So that's file data sitting on tape as standard storage. On the broadcast media, rich media, video surveillance market, that's tracked by another analyst named Tom Coughlin, who was at a different event today and wasn't able to attend. But what we're seeing in that market is for the long-term archive in a digital broadcast, right now we're seeing 33% of that data sitting on digital tape. The rest of it, interestingly enough, hard disk drives is only 25%. Everything else is formats that people are primarily moving off of. DVD, Blu-ray, those types of technologies just don't hold enough data to really meet the needs of these really big environments. What's even more interesting on that side is how quickly the tape portion is growing. That the tape portion is growing much, much, much faster than the hard disk storage market. That with rich media, it's projected that well over 60% of the archive data will end out on digital tape. We have a couple customers who are speaking here today that will be able to speak to the trends and why the market is using digital tape. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it's a very different mentality than we see often in the IT community and how they're utilizing the media, and really see digital tape as their go-to medium, where in the IT market is a shift where customers are starting to rely back on tape as their primary storage offload engine. So looking at the role of tape and how an active archive can be implemented in a data center, what we really see today, and as we look forward into some of the announcements we have, Nathan mentioned we have some new executives in the company. I'll be introducing them here shortly. And the reason we're looking at how can Spectra continue to take advantage of this data explosion for big data and cloud, this slide really illustrates it well. That as primary storage, the primary copy of data up in the left-hand corner of the screen started to get too full, too power expensive, used too much data center space, just could not actively be fit into a customer's budget to store all of their data. Active archiving came into place in the context of being able to offload data in an ILM or tiered storage way to high-density SATA type disk. That was about 2004 that we saw that happen. It enabled transactional data to stay where it belonged in the high-performance storage systems and to start to offload the rest of the data to higher density, lower cost, lower power efficiency, or higher power efficiency disk. That was a good move for the industry, and it certainly was a good start in figuring out how can we manage data more effectively. The difficulty there was there's a lot of complexities in user policies, data management, how you get the data in an ILM or tiered storage environment to those lower tiers of storage. So you ran into a lot of business process changes, CIO, COO type of involvements that had to be involved just to get the data where it really ought to be from a cost-effective storage perspective. So you just didn't see it take off in the user environment in the same way as it probably could have. Good idea, difficult to implement. In 2010, and this is around the time frame that the Active Archive Alliance was founded, we were able to extend that capability to offer file system access to tiers of storage, including tape. But what was different was it wasn't an HSM. It was the ability to directly move the files from your primary storage environment directly to your tape, give users access to your tape, just like you've plugged it into your laptop. I could have a petabyte share of tape storage that's presented on my C drive on my laptop. Behind the scenes, IT staff has the capability to set policies that certain data types, certain ages of data, certain quantities of data will automatically be migrated to the appropriate tier storage, either based on their policies or users' policies. It's implemented in a lot of different ways. But the important point here is that there's no need for user policy definition. All the business users have to do is set SLAs with their customers on the time to data of their environment. So if I had my C drive that had 100 terabytes on it, or let's say a petabyte on it, half my data may take 90 seconds or 120 seconds to actually restore and be back onto my laptop. That's when it's coming from tape. But it's completely transparent to me what type of storage it's sitting on. Other data that may be sitting on, say, a disk array may have a 2 or 3 second lag time, but it's all about just hit the time to data. There's absolutely no requirements to set new policies on how you're accessing that data. So what we saw as we started to have customers implement active archives into their environment using our tape libraries is the tape library shifted into a dual purpose role. It continued to serve as a backup copy for compliance, disaster recovery, but it moved into that environment where it was also presenting itself as just standard storage that the users were able to use to offload primary storage and solve some of those other needs. In the future, we see that the data center is going to change pretty dramatically. We absolutely believe that new data centers that are being architected in the future, especially as young people who are traditionally accustomed to using just storage, may not understand backup software, may not understand why you would want to go through a recovery from a proprietary file format when you could just sit behind a Linux-based system. Those types of things, as you start to see new data centers implemented, we absolutely believe that the traditional data protection application, that backup copy or backup application, will be obsoleted from the data center. The reason that customers will be able to do that is they can do it all in a single process through standard file systems with no proprietary formats. And if you think about how much that liberates the data center users from what they're having to do today to retrieve files, to get metadata on files, to index them, to actually make them usable in any way, it really makes sense. So the data center in the future, we really see that top tier is going to move much more to solid state disk and flash. It's going to be small amounts of data, highly transactional, where you're keeping only the appropriate data on that flash disk. You'll still see lower cost, higher density spinning disk arrays, but those aren't the high performance 15K RPM types of disks. That will remain your lower cost, higher power efficiency disk. And then most of the data, probably 80 to 90% of the data, will be sitting out there on the tape library. Disaster recovery, backup, second copies make sense, but you can make 2 copies of an archive, you can make 3 copies of the archive. There's no reason to go through a daily backup and keep 52 copies of your archive. So to give you a feel of what that means for the data center, the idea of removing the backup application from the data center, this is a kind of complex build of something that I bet most of you have done backups at least once in your life. How many of you have been a backup administrator? I have. Not that many. I know some of you are. So about some of you who aren't raising your hands, who I know very, very well, Howard, have been backup administrators in their lives. And the idea of this is take a 100 terabyte data set, doesn't matter what numbers you use, go through and do your regular increment of weekly full backups, incrementals 5 days a week, and I'll show you the assumptions behind this on the next slide. After a year, your 100 terabytes of primary storage data has grown into 2.5 petabytes of backup data. Even if you dedupe that, you still have 2.5 petabytes of data that you're managing. You have to know where 2.5 petabytes of files are. Your master servers, your media servers need to be scaled to be able to handle this kind of data. Your administrators need to be able to find the files without metadata on 2.5 petabytes of data. It's a very difficult problem. Sending dedupe after it means you have to have less storage to actually accommodate that 2.5 petabytes of data, but it still needs to be managed. The assumptions here, I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but it's typical grandfather, father, son backup, keeping annual backups for 7 years, the typical kind of environment that you would see in a data center. When the customers go through an archive, in most cases we recommend an active archive because why not keep your archive online, accessible, usable with metadata. But regardless, if they archive and take the data offline, or if they archive and leave it online in an active archive, most customers feel that they could archive about 80% of their data off. In reality, it's probably more than that if you look at the amount of inert data, bad data, inappropriate data sitting on primary storage. But just for the sake of this model, 80% of their data. And this resonates well, for example, with large financial institutes, large enterprise companies. In supercomputing, usually the numbers are higher, so our HPC customers we love because they think maybe 90 to 95% of their data needs to sit out in their archive, but in enterprise is closer to 80%. So in this environment, you've archived off 80 terabytes of data. 20 terabytes of it continue to go through your standard backup processes that you don't want to change, that your financial COO organization perhaps has required for your data. And so that 20 terabytes using the same policies grows to 520 terabytes of data. If you archive the other 80 terabytes and keep 3 copies of your archive, all 3 copies of those archives are accessible from users. It knows how to point to the different archives wherever that data is sitting in the world or the data center. That grows to 760 terabytes. So by archiving and keeping 3 copies, you have 760 terabytes. So what the net of this is you move from 2.6 petabytes of data under management to only 760 terabytes of data under management. You can still dedupe that if you want to. In some cases, archive data won't dedupe well because you're keeping so many less redundant copies of data. But if you think from an administration perspective, that's 1/3 the storage, 1/3 of the files, 1/3 of the metadata, 1/3 of the metadata that has to run on solid state disk to be able to get access to the information. Everything about this is about driving efficiencies in the data center. Why it hasn't occurred before today? There just wasn't that much data out there in the world. Now that data is repeatably growing this quickly, the industry has come together to make solutions to make this all manageable in the future. There was a EMC study that they funded with IDC, and I didn't put the slide in here, but it was talking about the data explosion and how there's a digital storage gap, that there's a belief that data is growing faster than storage capabilities are growing today, that by 2010 there's going to be a gap, that there's more data being created than there's storage available to put it on. So if people aren't doing something to manage their data more effectively, there could be a shift in even having access to storage to put the content on. So more optimal efficiencies that are easier to manage and give users direct access to their data really just makes sense. There's other portions of this in the tape market today that justify looking at active archiving, but tape, regardless if it's in backup or archive. Tape and backup really makes sense in disaster recovery as your third-tier backup, or in a lot of cases in cloud, we see tape as the final storage medium, as lots of small files come in from lots of users all around the world, and eventually get to a single data center where they're all consolidated into a single space. We do see that tape and backup makes sense there, where you get lots and lots of files in a co-located single data center. And the reason that we see that, and we do have a session later that talks specifically about cloud and big data trends, is the acquisition and the power costs. That there's lots of discussions out there about, is disk cheaper than tape? Is tape cheaper than disk? We have a lot of studies from a lot of analysts that still show that tape is, depending on how big the systems are, anywhere from about 2 to 6x cheaper at acquisition than a disk system. When you're talking about little stuff, little 20 terabyte, 30, 40 terabyte, that's not usually the case, but from about 100 terabyte up, tape is about 2 to 5 times cheaper at acquisition and about 50x cheaper for the ongoing TCO. The TCO analysis the Clipper Group put together, if any of you would like a copy of this, just let me know. They did a very methodical, analytical approach on a 15-year TCO of disk versus tape. EMC, NetApp, as well as all the tape vendors got the opportunity to review it. So it should be a fairly unbiased report. And they came out with some really interesting information about, if you look at the long-term TCO, and this includes energy, floor space, and the equipment costs, that the TCO is you're looking at long-term archives. So customers typically archive data for at least 10 years. A lot of them want to archive it for longer. The economics of it just can't compare. And so tape, as customers are becoming more and more used to the idea of, I can use it for just file storage, and I'm going to keep my data out there for a really long time, and it's this much more effective. These are the types of things that are leading to this resurgence that definitively turned around in 2009 for this portion of the tape market. So for Spectra Logic, what that's looked like is, this is a pie graph of the markets that we serve. Spectra, as I think most of you are probably aware, has been, we've been profitable for 6 years running, and we've been growing for the last several years in revenue, units shipped, media shipped. No matter how you dissect our business is growing. Last fiscal year, we grew at 30% year-over-year annual revenue growth. We closed our Q1 of this fiscal year with a 27% increase in our enterprise tape library sales, a 28% increase in our mid-range tape library sales, and a 24% increase in our media sales. This kind of trend is in part because of us taking market share, but it's in large part because the market's growing with active archive. But I don't want to belittle how much we've done to continue to get the market for the tape market growing. And I also don't want to belittle the fact that Spectra is taking market share from our previous competitors. The new executive announcement we have today is introducing 2 new leaders into our company. They're in the back, John Benson and Dave Trachy, if you'd stand up for us. So John Benson, I'm going to give you the introduction, and I'm going to have him say a few words just to say hello. He'll be around here until about noon today if anyone would like to speak with him. John was the general manager of the Storage Tech Tape division. He was the general manager of the Storage Tech Tape division when they were the market share leader, when they ran 9310, and when they ran SL8500. So all these big customers who standardized on Storage Tech Tape over the years were John's customers. John joined Spectra Logic this month and is running our new division, which is Spectra's new division for emerging technologies. His job is to focus on the next markets that will get Spectra Logic into new emerging storage markets. But it wouldn't be fair to say we aren't planning to take advantage of him to help take market share from his previous employer. John being here says a lot about Spectra Logic and our capability to deliver both to the enterprise and to the exascale compute environment. With him is Dave Trachy, who is also in the back. Dave was responsible for development in various different places on tape drives and tape libraries at Storage Tech. At Sun, he was brought in as the director of innovation at Sun Storage, working on lots and lots of the storage platforms that you guys knew and loved back at Sun. And now that they became Oracle, less enchanted with some of the work that Oracle is doing. And so the two of them came out together. We're going to be announcing the fact that they've joined the company tomorrow. And this is something that is the first of our announcements for today. So for just a quick moment, I'm going to hand it over to John just to say hello. And then we're going to jump on and I'm going to hand it over to Brian Granger, or I guess to Matt Starr.
So good morning. I hate podiums, so forgive me if I just stand out here and talk to you for just a minute. So nice to see so many friendly and familiar faces, and welcome to a beautiful day in Boulder, Colorado, in a beautiful venue. I was going to tell Molly we should probably take this outside and sit in the courtyard and have this, but we probably lose about half the participation. First thing is I've got to talk to Molly about my mugshot. Clearly, I'm going to have to do better if I'm going to be an executive in this company, because that looks more like Dave and I need to have little numbers up in front of me.
We'll Photoshop black suits on you. It's okay.
So again, welcome, and thank you for coming today to Spectra Logic to hear about all the things we've got going on. As Molly mentioned, a little bit of my background. A lot of you know me from the guy at Storage Tech, who then was the guy at Sun, who was then the guy at Oracle, who then was the guy who said, this is no place to innovate, who was then the guy who worked with the CTO and said, okay, let's go. Boulder County is a great place to start innovation. And so after leaving Oracle, Dave and I decided that we'd set out in this part of our careers to really work on what we think are emerging paradigms in the storage industry. And so people ask me, well, why Spectra Logic? And there's just a couple of things that I'll leave with. So there's a lot of reasons for Spectra Logic for me. If you ask my kids, one of them will say that's because the barbecue's on Friday afternoon in the backyard. And those are a good plus. But it's really about two things. So first of all, the financials are stellar. So she mentioned 31% growth, but if you peel the onion in the middle of that, what you'll find is a company that's really taken market share from the competition. And done a remarkable job of that, by the way, over the last 3 years. And I plan to be part of that as well. So expect to see a lot more of that in Spectra's future in regards to those kind of financials and in regards to Spectra's ability to take market share from the competitors in the space where we participate. The second piece has to do with innovation. So when Dave and I left Oracle, we started looking at the marketplace, and for the last 3 or 4 years, we've noticed some big shifts in the marketplace, particularly some new technologies that have come out that really starting to change the industry. And if you look forward and you try to project what the industry is going to be like in 5 years, it's not like it was 5 years ago where there was kind of wars between disk and tape and what was going to be bigger or smaller. It's really about the different kinds of technologies and how they come together to solve the workflows that our customers have. And so when you look at some of these markets, the media entertainment market, the HPC market, supercomputer market, some of the federal markets, there's a lot of great opportunities for Spectra Logic to take our active archive and project that and to do other things with technology that's coming out of the marketplace today. So Dave and I are here to work on those kinds of technologies. We're not going to announce those today. Expect another conference like this where we come forward and give you a lot of detail on that. But essentially, the reason for Spectra for us is if you look at big companies today, it's very, very difficult to innovate in a big company. And that's why you see so many acquisitions. From my previous employer, there are a lot of acquisitions. And that's because in that size of a company, just to get mind share and innovation is nearly impossible. On the other side of the coin, if you do a startup, you just have to go down the road long one to see how startups lives end up often just because of the amount of mass you have to create. Spectra is the perfect size company for innovation. Big enough where it has a lot of resources and capability to really facilitate great innovation, and yet small enough to embrace that innovation and allow innovation. So that's why Dave and I are here. I appreciate you coming today. I look forward to the next one of these and having a deeper and more in-depth conversation on that. Thanks and have a good day.
Thanks, John. So as you can probably imagine, the fact that Spectra is growing, we're profitable, we have some cash in the bank. As Nathan mentioned, we've just opened up some new facilities, and this is not the one we announced last year. We just acquired another building here in Boulder to continue our expansion into. Add to that, we've brought on the leaders from Sun and Storage Tech and storage, not just in tape and other areas. And it gives you a feel for Spectra has very big goals. We brought you here to Boulder to get you really up to date on Spectra, on how well we're doing in tape, and also to set the stage for Spectra will be doing more in the storage market, and a lot of that will be under the leadership of John and Dave. But next, I'm going to hand it over to the person who's gotten us here and will continue in that development. Matt Starr is our CTO, and he's going to bring you up to speed on how Spectra innovates, what is that process as a smaller company that we can go through to bring true customer value to our customers in a very real way that solves problems that wins us customers like NASA, like Nat Geo, the types of customers we're talking about today. Those customers, in large part, if we didn't do custom development and have this kind of innovation, wouldn't be Spectra customers today. And all of that's fallen under Matt Starr. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Matt.